Good afternoon and welcome to today's Apvp forum on the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, MUTCD. I'm Melanie Bowser, Apvp Executive Director, and we're very pleased to have each of you with us today. I'll start out with a few housekeeping notes as usual. All attendees on the forum are automatically muted. Due to the high volume of participants today, we ask that you use the chat function to type in your questions and comments along the way. Our facilitators will make an effort to keep tabs on the questions and field them as we go along. Today's forum is the second of a two-part series that Apvp has offered on the MUTCD. If you missed our initial webinar on March 10th, you can still access the recording on our website at apvp.org/webinars. And I'll now quickly introduce our facilitators. Jeremy Sharzan is the multimodal design practice lead at Tool Design Group and serves as the Vice President of Apvp. Katie Sawyer is a senior engineer at Tool Design Group and is an associate member of the National Committee of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And Michael Knoll is the chief engineer for the County of Kauai Public Works. And without further ado, I will go ahead and turn things over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Melanie. And Michael was having some connection difficulties, so he will be joining us at some point once he gets his computer working properly. So this is our agenda for the day. We're going to spend about 35 minutes talking about a couple individual topics and comments, issues from the MUTCD, and then we've reserved 15 minutes towards the end to discuss any issues that you'd like to bring up. So as Melanie mentioned, if you could enter any questions in the chat, as an additional clarifier on that, if possible, if you could enter the section number or the page number from the draft MUTCD when providing comments, that might be helpful in case we want to pull up that text on the fly. It's not a requirement, but if you're asking a very specific question, consider doing that. So with that, we'll get started. So the first topic that we'd flagged here is speed limits. So, well, actually, let me orient you to the slides. The bottom left is going to be the page number and section number from the MUTCD. And I'll apologize in advance. This slide deck is a little text heavy, as you could expect when doing a presentation on a design manual. There's a whole lot of text that we're talking about. So the way we're going to present this is the individual topic, and then we're going to poll the audience to kind of get a feel of our members' stance on potential responses to the MUTCD. So a tool that we're going to be using for this is Mentimeter. So if you could all, either on your phone or in a separate browser window, go to www.menti.com and use the code 65484045, and that code will always be visible at the top of these Mentimeter slides. And just to make sure that it's working, if you could enter a word that describes the MUTCD. I do have the profanity filters turned on, so don't try anything sneaky. It does seem like it's working. And so, like I said, we'll be presenting topics throughout this, this session, presenting potential changes, and then we'll ask you to respond to those potential changes. The other thing that I'll mention, I like that dinosaur. Another thing I'll mention is the way we've set up these polls is you will always have the option to choose no changes are necessary or you're unsure. If you select unsure, I'd ask that you add some clarifying statements in the chat window to help inform our conversation beyond this webinar. And also want to let you know that you'll be able to enter multiple results as part of those polls. So in some of these cases, it might be helpful for you to select multiple choices on the multiple choice questions. So back to the slide deck here. So the MUTCD is making some changes to their guidance on speed limits. Now, setting speed limits always has kind of had some hurdles. Many states have laws, or it's sort of documented in their road code that there are certain speeds that you're required to provide. And so trying to get over those hurdles can sometimes be a challenge. But the MUTCD has also always been one of those things that engineers would turn to say that there's nothing they could do. The speed limit had to be what was indicated, and they've done a speed study, and the 85th percentile speed said this is the speed that this street should be. So like I said, they have improved the language a little bit, but still provide recommendations to use 85th percentile speed in evaluating what the posted speed should be. And sort of the question would be, should the MUTCD be focused on safety or perpetuating this this loop of making streets higher speeds than sort of the desired speed or the speed that's appropriate for the character of that street? So on the right side of the screen, you'll, and this will happen throughout this slide deck, that you'll see the draft language from the MUTCD, and then I've highlighted some relevant sections in yellow throughout to kind of draw your attention to where a particular clause might be included in the text. So as I mentioned, the MUTCD does still reference the 85th percentile. They did move speed distribution of free-flowing traffic out of the standard and moved it down elsewhere in the document, but they still have this 85th percentile speed suggestion. So some of the potential changes for this might be removing speed setting entirely from the MUTCD, removing references to the 85th percentile speed and maybe using something like median speed or something else. Or another option might be removing the 85th percentile speed and providing a new framework for achieving a target speed. And a good example of one that I'm aware of is Washington State DOT has a sort of more progressive approach to looking at speed limits and trying to get those closer to the target speed to meet the character of the street. So going back to our Mentimeter, how should Apvp respond regarding speed limits? And as I mentioned, you can choose multiple options here. So you might think removing the speed setting guidance is the appropriate thing, or in addition to that, maybe providing some other guidance. So far, nobody thinks that it should just remain as is. Interesting. So remove the 85th percentile and propose something else is the top goal getter here. All right, well, I think this will be really helpful. Following this webinar, we'll certainly be having conversations on the community, and then as Peter is helping to develop our Apbp comments, we could be informed by the suggestions we're getting from your responses. And like I said, if there's some of you had suggested unsure or other. And so if you have clarifying statements or things that you'd like to add to that discussion, I think feel free to add those into the chat window, and we can add that to our notes of this meeting. So another topic that we wanted to bring up was signing, and I feel like this pops up on nearly every one of my bicycle projects, that many jurisdictions have seen the NCUTCD's proposed sign, and frankly, many jurisdictions have used this sign. But as we look through the draft document of the MUTCD, they're not really providing that NCUTCD's proposed sign, and instead are suggesting the use of a left turn yield to bike sign, the R10-12B. and that not only that, they're only recommending that it be used at signalized intersections, and they have a lot of clarifying language about how and where it should be used, that it should only be used where there's unexpected direction, location, or some kind of quality that would run counter to the typical bicycle lane. So sort of limiting its application and not providing a lot of opportunity for its use to communicate to a motorist that there may be a bicyclist present that they would need to yield to. There's also a stipulation in there that you may use the R10-12B sign to communicate to yield to bikes, and then it has the word or the R10-15 sign to communicate to pedestrians. It doesn't provide the opportunity for the use of both of them, and frankly, we probably wouldn't want both of them to be used due to sign clutter and additional confusion. So this particular topic is kind of spread out amongst a couple different sections. You can see that in the bottom left of the slide. Different sections are referenced here. So as we look at the actual text and think about the changes, the potential changes that we think should be considered might be adopting the NCUTCD's proposed sign outright, particularly since we know that many jurisdictions are using it or are planning to use it. And I've not seen anything to the contrary that it's understood by drivers. I also, in looking through the various requests to experiment, have never found a jurisdiction that only requested that sign for use. It's always buried as part of another request to experiment, for example, for signalization modifications, and then you include that as a potential treatment. But I do think that's a fairly good recommendation. Another proposal might be to allow both the bike and the ped sign, if necessary, to be used. Removing those limited applications that they specify for when you can or should use the R10-12B sign, or potentially provide guidance that bicyclists and pedestrian symbols can be replaced or supplemented on signs as appropriate. And one area where this could be potentially important is for jurisdictions where bicyclists are already afforded the same rights as pedestrians at crossings, and yet there's no sign to sort of communicate that legal framework. So providing that guidance in the MUTCD may also be helpful. So if we think about those as potential options, how do you think Apbp should respond to that particular area of the MUTCD? I always love Mentimeter when only the first couple people have responded and then the values start dancing around. So it feels like a lot of interest in using the sign that many places are already using, but also potentially having some clarifying language to indicate when bike and ped symbols can be used to communicate to other street users. So I think that's an interesting take on things. All right. Let's jump to the next one here. And Michael, did you get your computer working?
Yep, everything's
All
working.
right,
Sorry
perfect.
for the delay.
No worries. We're flexible.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Glad to be here today and part of this presentation and webinar. Counterfeit bike lanes. I think that I wanted to talk about this because I've been showing slides showing how to do counterflow bike lanes in training courses for 15 years, probably, maybe longer. and every time we show a slide that's proposed to be prohibited, design is proposed to be prohibited by the MPA. One thing I'll start by saying, though, is that up until this MPA, contraflow bike lanes or counterflow bike lanes were not included in the manual specifically as a possible treatment. And so you could do them because you can put together elements of things that are in the manual and providing a street that's two-way, where in one direction it's only one user type that's able to go in the other direction was always allowed. So that's a good thing that's in the MPA. But in doing so, the MPA had some challenging issues, most notably that it would prohibit parking, as shown in this image, between a contraflow lane and the curb. And yes, this is unusual. The drivers have to cross over the bike lane in the other direction to park. But on relatively low volume roads, this has been done dozens of times around the country, and it's working fine. So we think that they've been, like it says on the slide, been there for decades in many cases. And like I said, I've been showing them for decades. And there's no research that was used to show that these existing facilities are not working. So this is one that, while adding contraflow bike lanes in general, it was a good idea. Some of the standards, especially this standard, it was not so good. Next slide, Jeremy. So again, this is, as you saw in the previous slide, on the right side is the language from the actual NPA. The highlighted in yellow is that shall not use counterflow bike lanes between a general purpose lane and an on-street parallel parking lane for motor vehicles. So the potential changes or recommendations would be, one, remove that standard and perhaps change it to guidance or support. And so allow for some more flexibility with that. So guidance would be a should statement. It could say, instead of shall, it could say you should not be able to do this, or it could just say, it could be more of a support, saying if you do this, here's some challenges with putting a bike lane, a contraflow bike lane between parking in the opposite direction. And then I think the other thing is would there be some important thing to add on, adding guidance on what to do for the yellow line between the contraflow bike lane and the with flow travel lane. Because again, if people have to cross that to park, maybe some guidance should be included with that. Next slide, or I guess Mentimeter now, I think. So these are your options on the Mentimeter survey here. So how should Apvp comment about contraflow bike lanes? So you can read them, I won't read them out. Kind of related to the items that I just presented.
And Michael, as the results are coming in here, I always find it interesting the push for not having this sort of treatment, knowing that it's really only used on lower volume streets for the most part, and that the drivers seem to know where they can park. I do wonder where the push for this is coming from, and if it's somehow linked to the autonomous vehicles and that the vehicle itself is not going to know that it can cross. But that feels like a really odd requirement, given the fact that every installation that I'm aware of is well received and heavily used.
Yeah, I think you'd have to tell your vehicle to park anyway, right? It's not going to know where you want to park.
Right.
So, I don't know. Yeah, I think it probably has more to do with the fact that crossing a double yellow is generally prohibited, and so that's why, you know, having some guidance on what to do with the yellow lines perhaps does make sense. And by the way, I don't know if people recognize you can vote more than once. Not vote, I should say. You can choose more than one option on some of these items. Sometimes you may want to recommend that we Apbp provide multiple comments or multiple parts of those recommendations.
All right, let's kick it over to Katie.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about pavement markings and the use of colored pavement in the right of way. So I think you can jump to the next slide, Jeremy. There has been sort of a history of artistic elements in the right-of-way with the MUTCD. The original 2009 edition had some language that made practitioners think that the upper photo here that's a little blurry was compliant. So the use of colored pavement within the standard transverse lines of a crosswalk. And so practitioners were led to believe that that was okay, and that the photo on the bottom, that particular application was not okay, using the standard piano key style crosswalk and then supplementing between the keys. So across the US, there was a lot of application of the top photo, and eventually FHWA issued some additional guidance, and really hunkering down on the fact that they feel that the interior of crosswalks should be kind of standard pattern treatments. Jeremy, if you jump to the next slide, I think we've got some examples. So in the proposed MPA, FHWA provides this figure 3H1, which is showing some of the patterns that they find to be acceptable to use within the traditional parallel style crosswalk. FHWA, it's kind of interesting in their discussion of why they included this additional language. FHWA is asking that commenters provide human factors studies. They also would like studies around autonomous vehicles, and sort of any sort of studies that show that the use of artistic elements within a crosswalk is safe and effective, which is interesting because out of over almost 700 discussion topics that FHWA has in that document, I think this is the only one that I saw that they were expecting commenters to provide evidence and studies as to why other sorts of treatments should be allowed, which is quite interesting. So on the bottom of this slide, you can see sort of like what's most important with a crosswalk is that drivers can see where a marked crosswalk is. So, those transverse lines or the parallel style or ladder style crosswalk, having those be visible, thick enough, retro-reflective, indicating that traffic control device is certainly very important. But the supplementing in between those lines, does that really degrade the visibility of the marked crosswalk? So that's what FHWA is kind of standing behind, is that they feel that a paver or something like that the crosswalk is still very visible, and that any sort of other treatment than what they're showing here would not be safe. Could you go to the next slide, Jeremy? So here's an interesting example. So within the NPA language, FHWA actually indicates that, artistic elements may cause pedestrians to just loiter and wait around in the crosswalk because it looks nice, I guess. And so rather than just crossing the street, they're just going to hang around in an intersection. So this is an interesting example, the Abbey Road crosswalk. Just the fact that the Beatles took this photo means that on the right, this is what this crosswalk usually looks like. There's always people loitering the street trying to recreate that photo. So it's an interesting argument for sure. That the artistic elements shown below are actually going to degrade from the safety of an intersection. I think this speaks a lot to the fact that it's difficult for one manual to apply to all sorts of roadways and contexts in the United States. Surely artistic crosswalk isn't going to do much for a divided state highway that's 60 miles an hour. However, if you have a small neighborhood residential street and people are going 15 or 20 miles an hour, is the artistic elements really going to degrade from the crosswalk? So those are all sorts of questions that people have around this. So this is the specific language within Part 3. Aesthetic treatments within crosswalks should only be used on roadways with a speed limit of 30 miles per hour or less. the treatment should not degrade or degrade the contrast between the white markings and the pavement. It's kind of interesting here, since the right-of-way is dedicated exclusively to highway-related functions, a policy for using aesthetic treatments and crosswalks should consider whether their use or design is appropriate for the right-of-way. So this is the only place in the manual where it's pointing out this highway-related function. So that's kind of interesting. They provide some support, so that figure with the patterns that they prefer. There's some standard language in here that you should not be using multiple colors or symbols, and that people shouldn't loiter in the crosswalk. And by providing that artistic element, that you are encouraging people to just kind of hang out. And then as an option, they're saying that maybe half the width of the white line, you should have a gap between the treatment to kind of emphasize that marking. Can you go to the next slide, Jeremy? Jeremy, do you have the next? Oh, I'm sorry. It looks so similar. I missed it. So some potential changes here. So remove references to the right-of-way being for highway-related functions. There's other things that may be going on there. Remove references to example interior color for crosswalks. Move all of the standards to guidance. You know, keep some of that language about vision impaired people, but rather than telling people what they, telling practitioners what they shall do, provide some support and guidance as to what they, the concerns about safety. Remove the reference to pedestrians loitering in the crosswalk. Revise vision impaired pedestrian standard to not symbols and multiple color arrangements that could confuse. I've often seen guidelines that cities have used that say, geometric patterns should be avoided, or, confusion with other traffic control devices, such as like circular green and red and yellow balls. Those sorts of things should be avoided. So here's a Mentimeter question for you. How should Apbp comment about aesthetic crosswalks? So no comment necessary. Remove reference to highway related function. Remove reference to example colors for the interior portions of the crosswalk. Whoa, we're split. Split four ways.
That's one vote. and this is really one of those ones where I expect that people would vote for multiple things, given that each of these bullets is not mutually exclusive.
Okay, great. Yeah, and you guys can read. I don't have to read those off for you.
While people are voting, I'll just say that one about the highway related functions one was just baffling to me. I mean, the right of way is used for lots of different things. And to say it's highway related only is crazy. I mean, it's just patently false.
All right.
And then finally, one thing that the manual is kind of silent on is the use of a colored pavement for aesthetic purposes outside of a traffic control device. So for example, the center emblems and signalized intersections, because these aren't confined by a traffic control device with, reflective yellow or white paint, this really isn't covered. Did you have a Mentimeter for this as well, Jeremy?
There was this slide as well.
Okay. So yeah, the guidance is unclear related to decorative painted intersections. Not used to regulate, warn, guide, or communicate with traffic, and not retroreflective. The intentional non-use of reflectivity shall not exempt colored pavement from the provisions of this manual. And the word aesthetic doesn't show up in the MUTCD other than for crosswalks.
So this is one where I didn't give you very many options, and to some degree it's because they're not directly addressing this topic. So we were sort of interested to see if you would think that we shouldn't comment at all on it, because it seems like it's sort of open-ended and we may be allowed to do this, or to request that they add guidance, knowing that when we got guidance on aesthetic crosswalks, it maybe wasn't so flexible as what we're seeing in those images. And this one has a few more unsures or other. So again, if you have ideas about this, please add it to the chat so that we can capture that and also pass it along to Peter and other folks who are helping to develop our recommendations. All right, the next topic we wanted to bring up is curb extensions designed by pavement markings. And this isn't one that I've seen other organizations really commenting on, at least not too much. There were a few things that caught me off guard. One was the requirement to use solid double lines. I've certainly seen many of these applications, and very few of them use a double line. They're using solid lines and flex post, and that seems to be doing the job just fine. So it was interesting that they included that. And then they have this weird phrase in here that the area between that double line and the curb is being, quote, outside of the street, which is a little weird given the definition of street in the MUTCD and the sort of non-uniform use of this term in this case. So some potential changes we might consider here is to remove that definition about it being, quote, outside of the street. I've also seen installations, and particularly if we look at this example B, you know, that painted curb extension must be 30 or 40 feet long. So a pedestrian who's blind is going to be standing back at that curb line, waiting for a gap in traffic to feel comfortable stepping out into the street when they won't even reach the street for 40 more feet. So we have seen installations where you provide a detectable edge and guide the pedestrians out to where the actual crossing begins. So it would be interesting to see if FHWA would entertain a third option here and address what we've seen some jurisdictions actually doing. So how do you feel that we should respond to this? Do nothing, remove that definition of it being outside the street, consider providing that option C, or something else?
While people are commenting, I'll mention again, this is another one that baffled me. I mean, the street is defined as the entire right-of-way typically, including the sidewalk, by both the MUTCD and state vehicle codes. So it makes no sense to say it's outside of the street because the entire width between property lines or buildings is typically the actual, quote, street as defined by MUTCD and vehicle codes.
Yeah, and Steve, you shot me a direct message here. Yeah, it's weird. It uses the word street, not outside of the traveled way. So it's just a weird application of the terminology that is being applied non-uniformly when it comes to the pedestrian facilities. All right. Michael, you want to take this one?
Yep. Thank you, Jeremy. So a couple things. So in the manual, there's never been released even guidance, I don't believe, if I recall correctly, that pedestrian signals be required at signalized intersections. Here you see a picture. By the way, that's Charlie Zagier in that picture. I don't know if anybody knows. I know this photo from a long time ago. And my understanding of this photo was taken by Michael Ronkin, and Charlie Zagier, who is one of the top pedestrian researchers in the country, now mostly retired, literally walked out in this intersection not knowing it was a signalized intersection. Because if you're standing on the corner where he left from, you really can't see any signals because it's a one-way street. The signals for the street you're parallel to or behind you, and the ones for the cross street are directly overhead almost. And so, there's many places like this where it's very needed to have pedestrian signals. So The manual does now, and the MPA does include this new guidance that pedestrian signals should be installed at marked crosswalks at signalized intersections, but it's not a shall requirement. But also it's important to note that not in part 4, which is the signals part, but part 3, chapters 3C, new C3C, I think they've rearranged the crosswalk stuff in the new MPA, says that crosswalk markings should not be used indiscriminately, and sort of doesn't require crosswalk markings at signalized intersections either, even in urban areas where pedestrians are frequent. So you could, even if you had a shall, as far as requiring the pedestrian signals that where you have marked crosswalks, someone could say, oh, we just won't put the crosswalks in and get it out that way. So next slide. So here again, the highlighted yellow is the new guidance, or should, saying that pedestrian signals should be installed at each marked crosswalk at a location controlled by a traffic control signal, which is a good addition. But the potential change would be to make that a shall or a standard. So you shall have them at marked crosswalks at signalized intersections. And then also the potential of adding something in the, it'd have to be probably in part 3. It kind of goes between part 3 and part 4 that talks about requiring crosswalks or recommending crosswalks, either maybe a shall or a should in this case, to put crosswalks at all signalized intersections. And perhaps it might make sense to be more nuanced on that and have some except as noted provided in the option or something, where you could say optionally in very rural areas where pedestrians are very infrequent, not to require the crosswalks marked. But going to the Mentimeter now, I'll read out these changes or these recommendations. First, 1A, no comments necessary. 2, require pedestrian signals at marked crosswalks at signalized intersections. And the third would be require crosswalks at signalized intersections. And then the last choice would be unsure or other. And if you have any additional thoughts, again, put them in the chat if you have any suggestions on more nuanced language. And perhaps, Melanie, if you could put the Mentimeter information back in the chat again. A couple of folks have
I'm sorry, it's at the top of the screen.
Oh,
so it's
okay,
menti.com,
right.
and then the code is 65484045.
Yeah, thanks. Well, when we have the Mentimeter up, you can see at the top of the screen. There's a few people that joined or in the chat are asking for how to vote. And pasting it back in the chat would be helpful for others because the Mentimeter is not up the entire time. Thanks, Jeremy.
Mm-hmm. All right, next up, bicycle signal faces. So, the bike signal face received interim approval, I guess, a couple years ago now, but its use is somewhat restrictive, and this revised MUTCD is providing even additional restrictions on its use. So one of them is that guidance, they're providing guidance that if you're going to use bike signals, you need to use them consistently throughout a corridor and consistently throughout your jurisdiction, which is a little bit of a barrier to entry. If you already have some bike signals, then you're sort of being guided to swap them all out so that everything's consistent, with the thought being that drivers and bicyclists could be confused if you don't have uniform signals. There's also the standard that you can only use the bike signal faces if there are no motorists in conflict, unless you're giving the motorists a flashing arrow. And then they're also prohibiting the use of a bicycle signal face at hybrid beacons, despite the fact that we know that there are these installations that already exist, and that their application makes sense in the context of the ones that we can find in the wild right now. But this proposed revision would just outright prohibit that sort of installation. So quite a bit of yellow on this one. So potential changes that we could consider here are removing the guidance that they be used consistently and allow jurisdictions to use them and install them when they can. Revise that shall statement to a should to control the bicyclist when the motorist has a concurrent movement. And maybe a caveat version of this would be to add a threshold value where conflicting motorists might drive you to have that that sort of phase separated operation. And that's consistent with what we recommended in the MassDOT separated bike lane guide, that you don't necessarily need to always phase separate, but as the volumes of motorists get higher, the need for that sort of operations goes up. And then another potential change might be removing that prohibition on the use at hybrid beacons. So what do you think we should do about this one? And this is another one where I suspected there might be a few responses that folks might want to provide. Oh, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, removing the prohibition for use of hybrid beacons and making it with guidance instead. That would be another option that we could consider there, rather than completely removing it. Okay, thank you for that. And then another one, and I've already been getting comments from clients about potential changes that need to be made to designs based on what they're reading in the draft MUTCD, that they're suggesting that bike lanes should not be shifted away from an intersection unless you can get a whole vehicle length between the bike crossing and the travel lane. And I was sort of taken aback when I read this, because the 6 to 16.5 foot recommendation that's in the MassDOT guide, that comes from, that's based on research and the yielding potential that they see from motorists based on that sort of sweet spot of an offset from the adjacent travelway. And so FHWA's proposal, I've not seen research that backs up their recommendation that that be a whole car length, and recognizing the practicality of that, a protected intersection design would need a lot more space if we needed to provide a whole car length, or depending on what they mean by a whole vehicle length. If your design vehicle is a single unit truck now, are we pushing this crossing so far away from the intersection that it's never going to be practical to construct? And what are we basing that decision on? They also provide guidance that doing a bend-in type design, quote, improves the visibility of the bicyclist. And I found that a little amazing, given that essentially they're saying bend in and create a more conventional intersection design, for more of like a conventional bike lane design, which has a history of creating right hook crashes, and that's linked to the visibility of the bicyclist. So to sort of say that this configuration improves the visibility of the bicyclist doesn't really align with what we tend to see from crash reports and past experiences with conventional bike lanes. So what should we be commenting about this? Should we remove the guidance section entirely? This idea of providing a full car length, should we be doing something other than that and aligning with that 6 to 16.5? Should we remove support that says that shifting the bike lane in and doing the bend in design improves visibility, or should we be doing something other than that? And this is another one where we have quite a lot of unsures or others. So if it's other, please feel free to drop that in the chat so that we can capture it. All right. And that's actually our last direct topic. As I said, we reserved time for questions, so we're curious to hear, are there other direct topics that you'd like us to discuss or to have a poll about? I do have some blank poll slides, so we can ask some deliberate questions about topics that you have questions about. Michael, is there anything that you've seen in the chat that we should be discussing?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. As we discussed, I'm monitoring the chat here. A couple of things. Early on from Carrie Irons, why does the draft MUTCD section 9D04 require all numbered bicycle routes to be signed? This is a new requirement, does not reflect history, and will get significant pushback from local agencies. Further, named routes wouldn't need to be signed. Makes no sense. So
yeah, I think that's
discuss that further.
Something that could very easily be an option. I don't know if it should be a standard. It seems like agencies, may want to number their routes, but I'm not quite sure why it would be considered a standard.
I'll be honest, I'm not even familiar with that that recommendation in there, but from the sound of it, that one doesn't make sense.
Okay, another question, let's see. This one was really, probably people can just put this in the chat. And a few people did, but Barb Chamberlain asked, can we get locations of some of the examples of counterflow bike lanes with parking, like what I was talking about? And she's saying she'd like to go to Street View to explore. And there were a few examples put in the chat, but if anybody has any more, they could be put in the chat. I don't have any off the top of my head. I have pictures of them, but I don't remember where they are at the moment. I know there were some in Corvallis, Oregon, probably 20 years ago. But I can't think of exact streets at this point.
There's definitely one in Silver Spring off of Wayne Ave, and Washington, D.C. has a ton of them that look just like the photo that was shown. We could certainly dig up some more examples, though I'm sure the crowdsourced list of people on this webinar can probably add a few more examples.
Yeah.
There's a few in Cambridge.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Chicago as well.
At the risk of making the chat too busy for me to monitor, but go ahead and put them in if you have them. So there were a couple questions about warrants, pedestrian warrants. I know that's an issue that's pretty concerning to some. I don't know if there's any changes in the MPA about that I can recall, but the fact that the warrants for pedestrians for signals to be installed, period, based on pedestrian volume are pretty high.
There weren't a whole lot of changes, and you're right, they didn't remove the things that have long been thorns in many of our sides. I particularly find some of the language about not creating delay for motorists to be like somewhat silly, and it feels like that the language as written doesn't create a lot of the opportunities for things that we know jurisdictions are doing around the country, and the idea of anticipating what the volume of pedestrians is going to be when you install the signal, not waiting for and expecting people to cross where it's not safe to cross. That one feels like that language could be altered quite significantly. I also know from the draft AASHTO bike guide that we have guidance in there about there are numerous states that aren't allowed to use pedestrian hybrid beacons, so it's not a tool in the toolkit. And so if you meet the warrant for a pedestrian hybrid beacon, that implies that there's some need for additional pedestrian control. If you can't do a pedestrian beacon, then shouldn't that mean that you could install a traffic signal at that location? Sort of creating that opportunity would be a good consideration, as well as really looking at land use context and where there's natural desire lines. If it's not safe to cross the street and there's no reasonable opportunities, that in and of itself could be the need to install a traffic signal. And I would love it if the guide addressed that.
Yeah, there was a comment from Vanessa Lipsky from New York City DOT pedestrian unit. And I guess they've modified warrant 4 for their purposes to include more criteria such as crashes. And they're currently using that. Presented at the 2019 IT annual conference. They're asking for HPP's input on that and support to push this into the manual. So that's something that's in the chat that'll be in the record there. And maybe something we should look at as far as APBP's formal comments potentially. I do know that it's challenging with the MPA to sort of add new things that weren't addressed in the MPA, just changing things in the MUTCD that have long needed change but weren't addressed at all in the MPA, and that may or may not fall under that category.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what else? Let's see. Question, is there supposed to be a stop bar in front of the crosswalk? Technically, the MUTC does not require stop lines at every intersection, even when there's a stop sign or a traffic signal. And I know California's practice has been to not use a stop line and just use the crosswalk line as the limit line. I never liked that, and I always put stop lines in my work, even in California, but technically that's not required. That could be something that you know, getting people to stop further back from the crosswalk could be something that APP could promote, but I think it's one of those things that would be hard to do now as part of the MPA because it's hasn't changed. Not changing with this proposed MPA.
I did see a request in here for a Mentimeter, and it looks like
Okay.
it was related to the presentation 2 weeks ago, and about extension of bike lanes through intersections and the use of green pavement. Currently, the NPA requires that the green pavement in the bike extension match the dashed bike lane. So it has to be sort of that intermittent use of green. It does not allow for the green carpet, the solid. And there's a few other things regarding green pavement in the NPA, including the use of green pavement markings behind sharrows is expressly prohibited. I think that came as a surprise to some people. And then also the Part 9 requires that a separated bike lane or a buffered bike lane requires extension lines at every single intersection. So those were all sort of green colored pavement related.
So Katie, do you have a question that we could ask as part of the Menti? The way I have it structured is the question will either be no comment or you agree with the statement that the speaker just said. So can you create a one sentence thing that we could vote on?
Sure. I think Phil was asking specifically about the use of green carpet within the intersection.
Okay. So that's the question. Should we be providing comment that allows for the use of green in the conflict area as a green carpet? I'm glad that I built these extra hidden slides into the Mentimeter. Seems like there's fairly good consensus around that. And then I saw somebody flagging guidance on sharrows, and presumably that might also be about greenback sharrows and the fact that many jurisdictions are doing those and still having to jump through the hoops of the requests to experiment for that particular treatment. I feel like we've gone through many iterations of higher visibility shared lane markings and have sort of coalesced around the greenback shared lane marking, and that it seems to be working well. So I was surprised that they did not include that in this version. But we certainly can provide well, I'll just ask, do you think that we should be providing a comment that includes the use of a greenback shared lane marking. Barb, I had not caught that they had increased the speed limit where sharrows are appropriate. I always find it hair raising when I see shared lane markings on 35-mile-an-hour roadways. So if they're allowing it at even higher speeds, then that's sort of a problem. Any other major topics that you saw come in, Michael? We're kind of getting towards the end of our time.
Yeah, I'm trying to see things that there's definitely other questions that have come in. One question, someone asked if someone could pop a link to the draft MUTCD changes. If not in the chat, perhaps email it to everyone who attended. We could send a link to where the FHWA has that information, and perhaps even a more user-friendly version if that's available through Apvp at this point. There's some comments about the traffic control section and how horrible it is for walking and biking. I think there are some improvements in this MPA, but probably still could be better. There's a whole lot of details in there that we could talk about. There were comments about barricades to keep people out of work zones and that sort of thing. Let's see. One thing was, making sure that there's research referenced whenever they're proposing a change, because sometimes there isn't. There were a couple comments about that as well. Something maybe we could comment on as Apbp is about, why are we making changes that aren't supported by research?
All right, well, I think we need to wind down. I have a few closing slides and action items for everyone. So you'll all receive a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as the PDF of the slides. When you receive that PDF, this orange box right here, the sample comments, will be an active link for you. So you'll be able to just click that and see the areas where some of the comments are being captured, or at least the areas that should be commented on are being captured. So certainly appreciate everybody being here for this webinar. What we need to do next is begin to review those comments and continue the discussion on the Apbp community. So I know there's lots of good stuff coming in the chat here. It would be really great if you can continue adding that feedback in the Apbp community discussion, or if you're not an Apbp member, well, you could join. I would certainly encourage that. But if you have other things, tweet them at us or email them to us so that we can consider that as part of our assessment. Apbp is working with a lot of organizations in developing comments, and certainly Peter Kuntz couldn't do this on his own for reviewing the entire MUTCD. So there are lots of people who are looking over this document and providing recommendations and helping to facilitate this discussion. And you're certainly part of that during today's discussion. So certainly be discussing this with your colleagues, make them aware that they can submit public comments. As an individual, they can encourage their company or organization to submit comments. We'll be submitting comments as Apbp, and that there are lots of different avenues to submit comments and elevate the voice of these issues that really matter to us to improve street safety for all users. And again, the due date right now is May 14th. I don't expect that to be extended, so make sure you're getting that submitted. You'll be able to view other agencies and individuals' comments as they're submitted. I believe that's all publicly available, so that's another way to sort of get a sense of comments as they're coming in and help to inform some of your decision making. But we'll also make our final recommendations available to everybody so that you can use them as a starting point for submitting your comments. So thanks for Michael and Katie for helping to facilitate this webinar. This has been a really great start to digging into the technical side of it, but let's keep this conversation going. So thank you all for for attending, and we ended on time.
Hey, Jeremy, can we do one poll as people go out?
Sure.
There was the question as to whether there should be a chapter or part in the MUTCD dedicated to pedestrians, or if not, then things would just be as they are now, distributed around the various parts or chapters of the MUTCD. So I guess
Sure.
it'd be agree with that statement would be, should there be a part or chapter for pedestrians? And then I guess no comments necessary would be, it's okay to leave it the way it is where things are distributed.
Yeah, I think many of us were caught off guard that they added an AV section without adding guidance for pedestrians. Sort of runs counter to the actual safety issues we're seeing on our streets today. All right, well, I'll leave this Mentimeter poll up, but we'll end the webinar now. And again, thank you all for joining today.